one offender, one convicted, being released into a women's prison among inmates who are smaller, more vulnerable, less muscle mass, and so on, could do a lot of damage, even though it's
I agree.
a relatively small problem.
I didn't mean to minimize that.
Yeah, no, I know you're not. And, and again, our Democrat colleagues, do minimize the problem. Oh, it's only X number of people. But, Mr. Chairman, you had Mr. Goldman's quotes slightly off. You quoted him as saying jackbooted Gestapo agents. No, he called our hardworking men and women of ICE masked Gestapo agents.
Eliminating retention bonuses for the correctional officers while making sure that every masked undercover Gestapo agent with ICE gets a $40,000 bonus.
And with that kind of attitude toward federal law enforcement, no wonder in 2023, the Bureau of Prisons had a 21% unfilled position rate. But in 2022, the California Department of Corrections report found that 34% of transgender offenders who requested transfer to women's prisons were registered sex offenders. In the UK, that was more than 70%. California was allowing men who were convicted of raping women to suddenly identify as transgender and then be moved to women's prisons, where many times they continued their abuse. Female inmates like Dana Gray, who woke up in the middle of the night to a 6'1" male roommate pushing his intact genitalia in her face. Alyssa Kamholz, as a child, was routinely raped by her stepfather and his Hells Angels buddies. She eventually was convicted and sentenced to prison under the Three Strikes Act, and she referred to prison, federal prison, as her safe space where men couldn't hurt her anymore. But then, California prison. That was until one of the men who was among the abusers was placed in her room at Central California Women's Facility. The same prison had placed condoms in every day room. The issue of men in women's prisons, the United States is behind the times. In the UK in 2023, there was a reversal of course, and the UK banned so-called transgender women who have male genitalia from being placed in women's prisons. During the debate in the UK, a prison manager was on record saying that the majority of transgender women, so-called, began identifying as transgender after they interacted with the criminal justice system. You would think that the 2003 law, the Prison Rape Elimination Act, would protect female inmates from male abusers. But the Obama administration perversely used this very law as authority when he introduced a policy through the Transgender Offender Manual that required an inmate's transgender status to be considered when deciding whether to place them in a women's prison. The Biden-Harris administration further abused the intent of PREA by his new version of the Transgender Offender Manual that allowed inmates to receive hormone therapy, sex transition surgeries, and other medical treatment related to their gender identity. So at a time we have a $36 trillion debt and a deficit over $1.5 trillion a year, the Biden-Harris administration is paying for sex change operations in our federal prisons. So I would ask each of you, in your opinion first, Mr. Potter, does allowing men identifying as women to serve in women's prisons make prison more or less likely?
I would only be able to guess on that and say more likely, I would assume.
Yeah, thank you. Do you believe women in federal prisons deserve to be protected from prison rape under PREA?
Absolutely.
Same question for you, Mr. Pertel. In your opinion, does allowing men who identify as women to serve in women's prisons make prison rape more or less likely?
Well, as I said earlier, I think it places women in a much more vulnerable position, whether it's physical violence, sexual violence.
And in your opinion,
as we heard today, there are so many issues facing the Bureau of Prisons. This population is infinitesimal.
Right. And I think it's a small population. At the same time, one offender, one convicted being released into a women's prison among inmates who are smaller, more vulnerable, less muscle mass, and so on,
Yeah.
could do a lot of damage, even though it's
No, I agree.
a relatively small problem.
I didn't mean to minimize that.
Yeah, no, I know you're not. And, and again, our Democrat colleagues, do minimize the problem. Oh, it's only X number of people, but they're about well over 2,000 inmates who identify as transgender in the federal prison system. Not all of them are men in women's prisons by any means, but the potential is there. I believe it's not. Our Democrat colleagues say they're implying somehow we Republicans are obsessed with this issue. They began it under Obama. They continued it under Biden. I think we're returning to sanity under President Trump. Thank you very much for your testimony.